Okay, hopefully you can now see my laptop. So thank you, Steph. So as Steph said, we have the traditional route for using an HPC system is via the command line. So you need to have some familiarity with using a terminal. You need to know your way around kind of a bash interactive shell, which is fine for some people, but for some applications, or if your discipline doesn't sort of push you in that direction, we have provided this alternate route, which is BEAR Portal. So this was in development for quite some time, but we expedited its release at the beginning of the pandemic because obviously people needed access to these resources, and we figured it would be quite a helpful thing. So we've been developing it sort of over the last 2 years, and it's in a fairly sort of mature state now. I'd say it's broadly behaving itself. So it gives you a route to doing things such as accessing a terminal, so you don't need to use the terminal client on your system, but also it allows you to sort of bypass that process of having to write a job script, and will actually give you an interactive interface to your favorite application. So you've got Stata or Stata, depending on how you say it, MATLAB, R, JupyterLab, Code Server, various other options that have a graphical interface that you can then use via a web browser, but it's underpinned by our compute hardware. So the URL is portal.bear.bham.ac.uk, which you can see here. When you go to initially, you will be greeted with a sign-in that looks a bit like this. So this is standard. It uses the SSO sign-on that all of the other services across the university use now. So if you're already logged into your email, for example, then you should just jump straight through to the following page. I recently changed my password and it's very long, so I'm not going to go through that process there. So I have logged in this alternate tab. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of what this looks like. So that is your greeting page. As you move along the top bar, you can see all of your files. So initially your home directory at the top of that list, and then any BEAR projects with which you're associated, you will get the links to those storage directories for those projects. And then obviously you click in and you have some kind of interactive view, so you can access your data, you can download it, you can move your files around, all the normal things you'd expect to be able to do with a sort of command line interface. So that's files. There is also a job composer and a view on any active jobs that you might have running on the cluster. Broadly speaking, we actually sort of discourage people from using this and would say if you want to submit a batch job to the cluster, that actually use one of the documented methods via the terminal, via the command line instead, just because the job composer that's provided with OnDemand, so OnDemand is the system that underpins BEAR Portal. The job composer is a little bit lacking in features. So if you want to be able to customize your job script, which is often the case, actually submitting via the command line is probably better in this case. We provide, Steph touched on it, but we provide further training on how to do that. And there's an introduction to BlueBEAR course, which is primarily focused on how to write scripts and submit them. But there is a job composer there. You can actually jump onto a terminal itself. So if you don't have Putty installed on your Windows system, or you're elsewhere and you don't have access to a sort of terminal client with the authentication, etc., then you can use this route to jump onto one of the login nodes. So if you do want to write a batch script, you can use this route to get into that, which is quite convenient. And also, people often, in my experience, have issues with Putty. It's quite an old piece of software if you're familiar with it. So this may be a better route, and actually we're encouraging users to use the built-in terminal in Portal more. So here I can execute standard kind of commands to see what I've got stored on my home directory, etc. Good out of that. So files, cluster access. But like I said at the beginning, the main benefit of BEAR Portal is the ability to access interactive apps. And I will spin up a couple now. So in the interactive apps drop down here, you can see a list. When you log on to BlueBEAR, if you're a member of a project, you will probably see slightly fewer apps than I have, because I have access to the CCB apps at the top here. So your list will probably start at this data science section, but as you can see, we have JupyterLab, we have RStudio Server. And then we have a bunch of what are called sort of GUI applications. So the critical difference is anything that's listed under GUIs is essentially kind of a VNC or a screen sharing view on the app that's running on a compute node. With the data science and also the servers app at the bottom, which is Code Server, which is essentially VS Code, if you're familiar with VS Code, running in a browser. So VS Code, JupyterLab, and RStudio Server have a client server model. So effectively, it spins up a server on a compute node, and then the web browser connects to that. The advantage there is it's a much snappier interface. So you're not essentially doing VNC or X11 type forwarding in the background. You're actually using a client server model to access it. So the responsiveness is much greater. However, the GUI options, despite using a VNC type approach, are still much, much faster than what you would have got previously. So the earlier method, if you wanted to, for example, run MATLAB, is that you would have logged onto a BlueBEAR node, and then you would have X11 forwarded from your local computer via the SSH connection to the compute node. That was very slow because all of that graphical data was going back and forth over the internet, particularly if you're off campus. With the BEAR portal model, all of that communication between the kind of the graphics is done on BEAR itself, and then a kind of a more efficient or sort of stripped down version is then transmitted over the internet to you. So it's still much more responsive than what was previously available. I understand that most users here are using probably Stata or R. So I will spin up one of each of those and just show you what they look like. So if I select RStudio Server, I then have a few options to select. So the project under which I'm going to run this job will be, you may be attached to one or more projects depending on kind of how your BEAR accounts are set up. That will become clear, I think, when Steph covers that in a minute. How many hours you want to run your job for, which queue that's attached to. So again, different accounts have access to different levels of resource. That's covered by your queue, but by standard, you have the BB default queue. How many cores you want to run for your job. So I'm going to increase that to 4. So these are not what are called multi-node jobs. So if you're familiar with batch workflows on BEAR, on BlueBEAR, sorry, potentially you can have multi-processing, multi-core jobs that span multiple nodes on the system, so multiple computers on the system. That obviously gives you access to much more memory and much more resource. All of the BEAR portal jobs are pinned to a single node, so you can request up to, I think, 40 cores on a single node for your job, but you can't span across multiple nodes. So in that scenario, you will need to move to using a kind of a more traditional batch workflow. So the number of cores you want to request, and then in the case of R, the version of R that you want to spin up. So we'll go with the latest that's available, which is 420. And then there are some additional what we call meta modules that we provide. So essentially, these are a bunch of extensions to R that are available for bioinformatics or geo or economics. As you can see with this one, we don't have the geo or the economics modules available for 420, but if you jump back to 40, then we've got the economics one, for example. And that's the kind of thing that we can tweak if there's a need for us to provide different meta modules or add any further kind of extensions to the existing meta modules, then do get in touch and we can look at doing that. And I will launch that job, and hopefully it won't take too long. When I did this earlier, it took a very long time to spin up the job, but I'm hoping whilst I'm doing that. So I will just jump over quickly to Stata. Do people say Stata or Stata? Stata, okay. So like I say, this is a slightly different setup. So this is using a graphical interface that's forwarded. We'll go with Stata 17. Spin that one up as well. And hopefully they'll both come online at about the same time. So I've requested just a few cores. The more cores that you request for your job, the longer you may have to wait for that job to become available, just because of the way that the underlying kind of scheduler makes the resource available on the system. So Stata comes up first. RStudio Server takes a lot longer because it loads a lot more modules in the background. So its kind of module preamble is a bit lengthier. So we'll have a look at Stata first. So with the GUI series of apps, you get the additional sliders here of your image quality and compression. I tend to kind of keep those both on the low side just because I prefer a slightly snappier response, but you might want crisper corners, in which case you can kind of tweak those as you see fit. Oh, it just kicked me out. No, that's helpful. Let's try that again. Good, okay. So that's what it looks like. Essentially, it gives you what you would normally see on the desktop version of Stata, but just that single window, which I normally do that to, so it's full screen. And if you're familiar with Stata, you will be familiar with this interface. But this is underpinned by the amount of resource that you've requested. In terms of resource requests, we only provide one parameter, which is the number of cores. The way the BlueBEAR is set up is that for each core you request, you get around 4 GB of RAM. So obviously a 4-core job, which I think, no, I ran this as 2, so that's 8 gigs of RAM and 2 cores. Obviously that increases proportionally. So if you need more memory, you will need to request more cores on the system. The way that memory and cores work if you're submitting a non-interactive, so a standard batch job, is different, and you can be a bit more nuanced with how those requests go in. But on BEAR Portal, we just provide the one parameter for that. So that's Stata, and then hopefully RStudio is up and running. So like I say, it's a slightly different interface here. So this actually, this is not forwarding the graphics. This is actually presenting a kind of a web interface to R using an RStudio server instance that's sitting on a compute node. And in typical fashion, whenever you do a live demo, it's always extremely laggy. Let me just close that and launch that again. There we go. So again, if you are familiar with RStudio, you will be fairly familiar with the way that this system is set up. You can also, which is quite convenient, you can access a terminal window that's running on the compute node alongside the RStudio server as well. So if you want to essentially do work on a compute node in the terminal, it's the RStudio client is quite handy for that as well. There's a slight layer of abstraction. If you are familiar with these systems, it's actually running in a container, a Singularity container. If you want to know more about how that's working, then come talk to me afterwards, but I'm not going to go into detail on it now. But that is essentially a very brief overview of BEAR Portal. That's how kind of a GUI app versus a sort of a client server app works on the system. Does anyone have any sort of immediate questions about how that works? Or I'll let you go and experiment. Oh, hello.
When you open the BEAR project, so it's like any Dropbox folder where you can upload your files.
Yeah.
And you can directly access the files from the RStudio Stata over here.
Yes. Yeah. So so if we go to server here, if I go to open, I then have access to, by default, my home directory. So they're with Jupyter Lab and with RStudio, there's a little bit of a workaround because it gives you access initially into your working directory as your home directory. With some of the apps, we provide a way of changing that over. But actually what we generally suggest is that you create a symbolic link, so a symlink, in your home directory to your project directory as well. And we have documentation on our website about how to do that if you're not familiar. It's a single kind of command that you have to execute in a terminal, and then that just will present everything together, so it's just easier to navigate around. There are other ways, but that's the simplest way. And then, yeah, you have access to all of your project data by these routes as well. Hello.
So I was wondering, for example, if after I run in my R, I got like 100 files finished. Previously, I can map those files in my home computer working directory, and now I have to download the one-by-one from the.
So it depends what you need to do with the files afterwards. So I mean, sort of once you've migrated your workflows into the sort of the BlueBEAR ecosystem, actually all of your data will then sit on the RDS. So if you need to then sort of pull it into different scripts that you're running on the RDS, then you can do that kind of in place essentially on BlueBEAR or via a different app. Alternately, you can pull the data down onto your local computer. So you can either mount your home directory or your project directory as a map it as a drive on your Windows or your Mac systems, or you can SSH. There are various different ways to transfer, or like if it's a large amount of data, like Steph said, there's Bear transfer as well, Bear data transfer. So there are various different ways. Once that data is produced, it will be on the RDS, on the research data store, but there are lots of different routes into pulling that data off and moving it around as you need to. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'll finish up and hand back to Steph. Let's switch it back.
Too much noise with the mic.